Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar entitled Team Around the Student. And this webinar, we've sort of focused it particularly towards team managers, senior practitioners, some of you who may have practice education experience, but particularly perhaps those that don't themselves, but may have team members who are considering becoming practice educators, on-site supervisors, and having students in your team. So just who we are. My name's Sue Duval and I'm a consultant social worker with the West Midlands Social Work Teaching Partnership. The slide shows the other people that are contributing this morning, but they will introduce themselves as they come to their section of the presentation. For those who might not know, the West Midlands Social Work Teaching Partnership has a vision, as stated there, to achieve excellence in social work education and professional practice through a co-produced, research-led and strength-based approach. And one of the aims we focus on is to ensure that students undertake high-quality statutory placements which develop their knowledge, skills and experience to practice as newly qualified social workers. And this webinar is one of a suite of webinars of CPD training that we put on as a partnership to support practitioners across the region. So you're very welcome this morning and I hope you find it helpful. As I said, the aims of the session increase team manager, senior practitioner confidence and the ability to provide high quality student placements within your teams and reimagine how a team approach is possible in the current working environment. And this is particularly holding in mind this climate of more flexible working patterns, greater ability to work at home, dispersed teams, hub locations for office working, and generally fewer in-person team activities. And because of that, we felt it was particularly important to have a session specifically focusing on the importance of the team approach to supporting students. We will be looking at planning for placement and the placement experience in two separate sections. In terms of asking questions, if there are any particular questions that you have or points for discussion that you'd like to raise on the topic of creating a team approach to student placements, please do put them in the chat. We have allowed some time at the end of the webinar for questions and we will monitor the chat as we go through. So feel free to use the chat function. So just a little bit about what's the background to this particular webinar. In January 2021, the Teaching Partnership did do the first webinar entitled Team Around the Student, and that's actually still available on our website with a link to a YouTube recording of that. And that covered particular different topics such as the application and interview process for social work courses, reasonable adjustment processes, the roles of people involved in placements, the organisational perspective, and what is a learning organisation. So if you've not already had a chance to look at that webinar, I would encourage you to review that at some point when you've got time. And what we wanted to do was build on that, because I think even then in January 2021, coming out of COVID, but still very much living with the effects of it, we perhaps none of us really thought that this hybrid, flexible working from home, increased use of Teams and Zoom was here to stay as permanently as it clearly has been, and how it's now become embedded practice in our teams, not just in the social work profession, but in so many different aspects of life. And so I think that, and even where services are ostensibly face-to-face services and visits have gone back completely to in-person visits, so many other aspects of the job are now online: team meetings, supervision, peer support sessions, and just simply the fact that there aren't the number of people in the office that there used to be to create that informal learning environment. And so we just wanted to really reflect specifically on how practice has changed and think about, what you do need to consider in order to provide that team approach to supporting student placements. The other activity which has informed this webinar was a readiness for placement practice group that we ran last summer when we were thinking about priority areas in relation to students being prepared for placement. The group identified professionalism as a key focus for this, and the group also discussed the impact of hybrid working on the ability to assess and support a student and to evidence professionalism in their placement. And some of the recommendations from that was to really think about hybrid working arrangements right from the point of mapping and matching student placements, but also about whether students have suitable confidential space to be working from home, which will all be things that practice educators or on-site supervisors will be considering when they're thinking about a student, but also perhaps for you to have consideration of as a supervisor of those practice educators and on-site supervisors. And that group also recommended that we perhaps ought to revisit this team around the approach and put on some training around that. And so that was another driver for this webinar. And the reference to both of those are on the slide at the end of this presentation. So just before I hand over to my colleagues, just thought it would be helpful to think about the team from the perspective of the secure base model. Some of you may be familiar with this model, which came originally from some work by Schofield and Beek at the University of East Anglia. And they developed the model as a way of working with foster carers originally, but it has been adapted and used in different situations. And this version, thinking about the team as a secure base, the concept of the secure base comes from attachment theory, and the idea that our relationships with significant others who are available, sensitive to our needs, and reliable provides us with a safe haven to return to when life is stressful. And what we're thinking of, this model can be a helpful way of thinking about your team across the 5 dimensions of availability, sensitivity, acceptance, cooperation, and team belonging. And it might be helpful to reflect on how this model could be relevant to your team, particularly in view of thinking about a student joining your team and how that student might experience the team. And my last slide looks at those different domains, and those statements are the descriptors that the model puts against each of those 5 areas. But things that you might be wanting to think about in terms of availability: can team members call on support from each other or you as the team manager when needed? How do you create systems and a culture of availability in your team? And later on, we might look at some examples of what you might do to facilitate that. Sensitivity. Are you aware of individual needs in relation to managing the emotional parts of the job? And how do you know when team members are stressed? And how might power difference affect the extent to which a student or even team members feel confident to share vulnerability? And how can you support this? Particularly, again, thinking about students coming into your team for a short space of time. In terms of acceptance, is there a team culture which encourages the use of mistakes as learning opportunities and the opportunity to improve? How are mistakes reacted to within the team? How do you acknowledge when things go well, and how is praise managed? And how might culture, ethnicity, and diversity influence the judgments team members make to one another? And then in terms of cooperation, how is skill sharing encouraged, and how is collaborative problem solving experienced in your team? And then on the last aspect, very simply, how do you welcome new and say goodbye to old team members? And how does the team manage change? So again, those are just 5 different dimensions, and this webinar just a bit of space to reflect on your team and your team culture and the aspects of it that might make it feel a safe, secure base for a student joining your team in the future. And now I'm going to pass over to Emily to move us on to the next slide. Do you want to introduce yourself, Emily? Thanks.
Yeah, my name's Emily Witt. I'm a team manager at Wolverhampton in the Child in Need Child Protection team. So I'm going to be discussing around the practical arrangements for students. So practice learning is central to the assessment of social work students. We very much hope that both students and the placement enjoy the practice learning experience. We know that commencing a placement can be stressful for students, and we want to make the initial part of the placement as less stressful as possible. I'm going to discuss some practical arrangements that we can consider prior to students commencing within our teams and following their successful initial interview. As soon as they've had their initial interview, have we commenced the process of ordering equipment and any specialist equipment that they need for any additional needs? Have we had a conversation with the work-based supervisor regarding any worries, concerns or questions that the student raised in their initial interview, such as childcare issues or location of families that can be addressed and support implemented? Consideration for the student joining a team meeting prior to them commencing. We've had positive feedback from students where they've joined the team meeting prior to commencing so that they know who they're joining and what the team is like prior to coming to the team. Have we considered the first day arrangements around where they're going to be meeting, who they're going to be meeting, and what that first day looks like in terms of induction? When students commence our team, they are all added to our team chats, and this enables the student to feel welcomed to the team, and all the social workers tend to put welcome to the students so that they feel part of the team and a sense of belonging. Next slide, Sue. As we know, COVID is still about and the knock-on effects still remain. However, we need to consider the impact of this upon our students joining the team and how we can address any worries, concerns that can be generated. It is important that students are aware of hybrid arrangements. Are there any mandatory office days within the team that the student needs to be aware of? As these days are crucial for students to be part of team discussions within teams face to face. The benefit of hearing these discussions is important to their development. Discussions within the team around any changes. So prior to a student starting, are discussions within your own team being undertaken to see if the team recognise any adjustments that we need to make to ensure that the student feels supported? We do advocate face-to-face meetings within teams and encourage students to complete these with families and the social workers within the team. Since lockdown within our team, we still have the daily check-in. It sounds a bit of an overkill, but it ensures student social workers know that the team manager and the senior social workers are available for half an hour every morning where we have that as protective time. So that enables students to discuss any issues that they've had from the previous day, any issues that have arose from the night before or that morning. And what happens is the students, the social workers generate those meetings every morning if they just want to touch base with anybody, so that they know that they've got somebody to approach every morning, and that time's protective for them to look at what's happened, what's going to happen, and if we can pull together to look at any additional support that anybody needs for that day. Next one, Sue. So preparing for learning opportunities. It is important that we touch base with the work-based supervisor as a team manager or senior practitioner to ensure that we have knowledge and understanding of the students' learning needs and how we can support them in addressing these. Do they have particular interests or gaps in their learning that they wish to develop? Students have lots of different opportunities within social work teams, and here I've put some examples. So we tend to have like an induction during the first couple of weeks where they have the opportunity to meet different teams within the local authority to see what support they can offer to support us as social work students. We look at co-allocating cases with social workers. We look at pieces of work. We had a fantastic outcome where a student and a social worker did some really good joint work where the social worker completed breaking the cycle assessment with the parent, and then the student completed some direct work with the children. And as it was a collaborative approach with the student and the social worker, the outcome of the assessment was really positive and the children really benefited from the work that the student did. Also attending like strategy meetings so that the social worker the student can see the process of a concern. So looking at processes within the social work environment, where the concerns started and then what's the process moving forward and what discussions happen in those meetings. Supporting social workers in attending meetings and supporting with minute taking. Completing visits with social workers. Shadowing workers within the team, such as duty tasks, and encouraging students to attend reflective practice, where we discuss issues, ideas, lots of different things, and where we can look at solution circles to discuss ideas collectively. Thank you, Sue.
Sorry, realised I was on mute. Thank you very much, Emily. And I'm now going to hand over to Helen Franklin.
Okay, so I've been asked to kind of, I suppose, think about this from both a university point of view and I suppose thinking about how you support Emily's talked a bit about supporting the student, how the student can be supported on the team, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about, I suppose, how you as managers and supervisors of the practice educators can work with them to make sure that it works for everybody but on the team. So for those that don't know me, I'm Helen Franklin. I'm a lecturer in social work at Keele, and I've been working with students from practice education over the last almost 15 years and 20 years as a practice educator. So it's been quite a long time working, I suppose, with both teams and the students and practice educators on those teams. So I guess the first thing then, as I suppose, a manager or supervisor that you want to be thinking about is who are the people on my team that are going to be acting as the supervisors or the practice educators within that team. Under the Practice Educator Professional Standards, so those of you who are practice educators will be aware of those. Those of you who are not may not be aware that there's a set of professional standards for practice educators. Under those guidance, what they will say is that on completion of their stage 2 of that every social worker must be at least 3 years post-qualified on completion of stage 2, which means that when someone's probably around 2 years post-qualified, you might want to start those discussions with that member of staff about where do they want to take their career next, and particularly when we're looking at moving forward to a 2-year assessed and supported year in employment, or 2 years in employment as it will be now, and that early career framework, you might want to think about who is it that I am going to be identifying to sort of move forward to take on the practice educator and on-site supervisor within my role. And thinking a little bit as well about, I suppose, lots of local authorities now are thinking about student placements, particularly in terms of their recruitment strategies and how we actually we have sufficient social workers staffed on our teams. So it's important really to be part of that process and thinking about the training and taking students on board so that we have the workforce of the future for us. But they have to be supported by the right people as well within that team. And some of that's around the team and some of that's, around your role in terms of who on my team am I going to support to put forward to undertake the Practice Educator Awards. So think about when you're talking to your staff there think about what they've done sort of generally in terms of supporting others before. So, how do they respond to new members of the team? How are they working with perhaps newly qualified who start on the team? Have they supported students on the team before where perhaps there's been another practice educator or supervisor, but they've been someone who showed an interest in taking that person out shadowing or providing some joint working or whatever with that person? Think about where they are in their career. Are they ready to sort of think about preparing to manage or supervise others? Do you feel that they have that readiness? Because ultimately, you know, it's down to you as their manager to release that person to undertake the role of the practice educator and the award there. And then once you've identified that person, make sure that you're keeping that professional development as a practice educator or on-site supervisor on your supervision agenda. It's not something that we sort of discuss once and tick the box and say, right, that's done, you're doing that now. But recognising that the practice educator role has now become part of their workload, particularly when the student is there on placement. So just keep it under review and think about how's it going, how's supervision with the student going, is there anything that you're concerned about, to have that open dialogue really with that member of staff, so that you have that and recognise, I guess, how working with the student might be impacted on an allocated workload. Okay, next slide please, Sue. Just to note about how the students are selected. So for those of you that perhaps aren't aware of the background as to how that works. So the universities will usually send us a bulk of profiles to the Workforce Development Service, and the universities will have screened those already to look at geographical areas of interest, any commitments that the person has, so that they're not doing a huge commute and have to leave really early to pick their child up from nursery at 5:30. Trying to think about how it is that people geographically are located and where that sits, and then also where their areas of interest are. So are they looking at children's placements? Are they looking at adults placements? So the universities will send those profiles out to your workforce development teams. Your workforce development teams will then go through those profiles and think about the teams that they have with practice educators available, and start signposting different profiles to different teams based on, I suppose, what the focus of the team is, and anything written in the students' the student supporting statement about where their areas of interest lie as well. So that's how, I guess, the student gets initially selected and ends up sort of coming to your team for interview. Often as a team manager or supervisor, if you're not in the practice educator role or the on-site supervisor role, you're not involved in the actual sort of interviewing of that student. But what you might want to do is sit down with your practice educator or sit down with your supervisor and talk about perhaps some of the questions that they might want to ask. So you might want to talk about what they need, and you might want to talk about the different, I suppose, the different things, that the different needs that they have and what they want to get from that placement. And again, you can have that conversation with your practice educator or supervisor when they come back from that meeting to say, right, this is what they've identified, these are things that we maybe need to be thinking about as a team as to how we support that student. And I think that covers both of those elements. So you're thinking about how we build that as part of the team. So you can then help to support your practice educator and your supervisors as a team manager with an awareness of, I guess, the overview of the whole team as to where perhaps areas of support might be. Okay, next slide for me, please. Okay, so then going back to supporting and I've linked this to the practice educator professional standards, and think about how you might want to support your practice educator on the team. There are 4 domains of practice educator standards that your practice educators are working towards, and these are just some areas where as a manager, you might want to think about supporting your practice educator in achieving these, but making sure that the placement is also running smoothly. So the first domain is there around working with others to organise an effective learning environment. So thinking about working with your practice educator and others on the team, sort of encouraging a culture whereby, you know, people are offering shadowing. It's not like pulling teeth and dragging people to get them to do shadowing. It's about actually people want to be offering shadowing and have a real culture of that. You might want to think about some sharing experiences, maybe some joint learning, for example, with a newly qualified worker on the team. Is there something a newly qualified and student could perhaps do together, learn together as a kind of a piece of work with a similar focus? You might have someone who's perhaps interested in doing practice educator, but not just yet. Could they have a minor role with that student? You know, could they be the person that perhaps covers the supervision for or mentoring at least for the week that the supervisor's on leave, for example. They might be the go-to person, the touch base person for that week, for example. So think about different ways that you can involve the wider team and the staff on the team as well. That creates a really good and effective learning environment that doesn't all fall on the practice educator or supervisor. And I think on that note, really, just sometimes we hear practice educators and others on teams talking about sort of my student, or it's their student, they've got a student, actually maybe trying to refocus that. So actually the student is placed on our team. That member of staff has a responsibility for the management and oversight of that placement, but actually the team are supporting that student around them. We've talked about hybrid teams, so Emily's already talked about that, so I'll miss over that. And I also mentioned earlier there about talking to your practice educator or your supervisor about the student's learning needs, so that you can maybe think about the breadth of the work the team's doing and whether there's other pieces of work that you might want to talk to that practice educator or supervisor about that somebody else is maybe holding that might be interesting for that student to either get involved with, to co-work, or just shadow to get kind of a real kind of sense of what's happening in the team and the different aspects of work that you cover. The second domain is around teaching, facilitating, supporting learning and professional practice. Talk to your student about how, talk to your practice educator about how the student learns best and what they want to get out of that placement, because then again you can help to maybe identify some pieces of work that the practice educator might want to consider for that student. Think about perhaps allocating that student separate pieces of work rather than a caseload, for example. So it might be that you're pulling out different learning experiences, they're managing a workload, not necessarily a caseload. And that can actually work quite well, particularly where you have students who may have certain limitations. For example, if they're limited by not being able to drive, for example, it might be that actually there's pieces of work in a particular geographic location that is spread across the team, but they could be doing because it's accessible via public transport more than perhaps another area of the patch that you cover. So very much think about, you know, am I thinking about this as a kind of get on with a caseload, or actually I'll be looking at how a student can manage some workload, still with the same deadlines, still with the same things to do, but perhaps in a more kind of varied way. You can talk to your practice educator or supervisor about how they're teaching and the impact on their time. For example, supervision can be an hour to an hour and a half a week. That's quite a significant impact on the time, and recognising why it's that length. That's what universities expect for the level of support and supervision for their student. Some of that might be, well, we've had a conversation here, so we can lessen that a little, but for a lot of it, it's about that reflective discussion. It's about students who are perhaps unsure, needing reassurance, needing kind of some really clear direction. So it does take quite a bit longer than perhaps a more experienced worker supervision might. Do provide constructive feedback on the student's work. If you've been asked to sign something off, you know, drop your practice educator a quick email saying, I've just had a look at that student, it was great, or perhaps they need to think about doing this slightly differently. Or if you need to send it back, you send it back with, you know, the constructive kind of advice as to what you're looking for. But really kind of having that kind of thought about constructive feedback, not just being about the developmental needs, but also the positives as well, because actually students need to know that they're doing the job okay, as well as, you know, if I've not heard anything, that must mean it's maybe okay, but I really don't know. It's really good for them to have that reassurance as well. And just talk to, again, you know, for your practice educators in training, you know, just be aware of that course commitment and the student support as part of their wider workload. Next slide, Sue. So we've got the final couple of standards. So they've got the managing the fair and transparent assessment of students in practice. So it's the practice educator's responsibility to assess that student. So talk to the practice educator. Are there any gaps? Is there anything the student's missing? Is there anything we need as a team to be able to provide for that student to be assessed against particular areas, to make sure they've got the evidence to meet the PCFs, the professional capabilities framework that they're working towards? And then, you know, both yourself and encouraging others on the team to provide that regular feedback. As I said, it's evidence for your practice educator and supervisor, but also it's, you know, it's evident, it's it shows that the whole team are working with that student as well, and remembering, as I said, the positives, because it's very easy to give constructive criticism that's negative or developmental, but sometimes we forget about actually that was really good, particularly when somebody's learning, that they don't know it's any good unless somebody tells them. And then the final domain that practice educators are expected to do is developing their knowledge and continuing performance as a practice educator. So this isn't about saying, well, the student's finished, that's the end of it. It's actually about saying, well, how are you going to now continue to use those skills? How are we going to think about, is it another student? Do we get you involved in mentoring an ASYE who's coming onto the team? How do we use your skills that keeps that currency? There's an expectation that practice educators are involved in the teaching of social work students, or at least learners, at least one every 2 years. So how are they going to maintain that currency? How are they going to sort of keep tapping into and being involved with the practice educator side of things? And that doesn't mean doing things, really frequently, but it might be about, once or twice a year, perhaps being involved in interviewing prospective students, or sitting on panels for assessment at university if the opportunity arises, perhaps half a day a year, or half a day every 6 months. Just keeps the hand in, but it's not too much over the grand scheme of their substantive position within the team. Next slide. Sorry, I'm kind of conscious of time as well, Sue, but we'll get there. So what happens if you feel as a manager or supervisor that the student isn't on target? I think this is something that's kind of a tricky one, and something that I've come across a couple of times, either from the student's perspective, because it's come back, the student said the team manager's saying this, and I'm not sure what the practice educator thinks, or it can be really difficult for students. And I think for me, being on kind of the other side of that, is just a couple of do's and don'ts really about how to kind of manage that if you think that the student isn't on target. What I would say is talk to your practice educator and your supervisor. They might have similar concerns, and they might be dealing with it and assessing the students similar ways, and it's good to share that, and it gives them more evidence if you're doing that. You can provide constructive and evidenced feedback, because that's the one thing. If a student's not going to be successful, we need real core evidence as to why that is. So make sure that you've got evidence in terms of the feedback you're providing about particular areas of work, things that need to be developed, and offer that support and guidance as to how the student can improve that practice. So it's part of a process. What can they do to actually make things better? Discuss with your practice educator how the student will be supported to address those concerns. And if the concerns are significant, encourage that practice educator to talk to the workforce leads for support, or go to the student's university about, these are the concerns we've got. The student doesn't seem to be on target. We need to have a meeting to sort of think about where we go from here. And there are policies and procedures in place which your practice educators will have access to and will be aware of. But I would also say, do recognise that a student placement learning, it's a process. It's not sort of a snapshot assessment, or one incident means that it should all be over. It's a process. So, think about this as the student isn't going to be the finished article on day one, but they have to be seen to be improving. If we've given them feedback, what are they doing with that feedback, and how are they managing it? So thinking about that. What I would say is, don't raise the concerns with the university workforce development or the student without your students or your practice educator's knowledge. I've seen that happen in both situations, and it can be really unsettling. So make sure that the placement is being managed by the practice educator. You're feeding into that process, you're supporting the practice educator, but they're going through the correct process and channels to deal with that. If you are having a conversation with a student and giving them some feedback, try really hard not to use the words things like concerns or failing, because students will, that's all the student will hear. They will and then they'll panic, they'll come back to the university, and it just becomes really messy. So think about it as a process. Give the constructive feedback, but also think about what they have done well at that point as well. But ideally, work with your practice educator, or ask your practice educator to give that feedback. Do it together so that it's part of that process. And the bottom one there is, don't try to override the practice educator's assessment. They are essentially responsible for their assessment and the management of that placement. So you can work with them, you can support them, but also the bottom line is their assessment, and their assessment has to be evidenced and evidenced against their professional capabilities at the right standard. So the professional capabilities framework, if you're not as familiar with them, are incremental, and there are different levels depending on where the student is at first placement, final placement, or ASYE level. So the practice educator will have their eye on which level the student is working to as well. Okay, next slide. So what happens if the student does fail, placement is terminated? And I think this is always really difficult for teams because there's always those questions of, could we have done something different? Did I do something wrong? Should I have taught them something earlier? Did I, all these feelings of guilt, because often for a student, this is kind of what they've built themselves up to. And it's been taken away by the decision that's been made, either by yourself, by the team, by the evidence that's been gathered, and it's really, really difficult for all concerned, really, and it's quite hard. So do ensure you're debriefing with your practice educator as their supervisor, listening to them and giving them that reassurance and sort of talking through it with them. As a team, have a debrief as well. Was there something we could have done as a team? Was there something, how did that work? And actually the team may well have some similar feelings to what an individual practice educator would as well. So do look at that as a kind of a team process as well. What might we do if we're taking another student on? Is there anything we could have done differently? Think about any learning as a team that you might have and take your time before you perhaps agree to have another student. So if there has been a difficult situation for the team and a student placement hasn't been successful, are we having another student straight away, or should we actually give ourselves a little breathing space before we agree to have another student? And you can link that back to the acceptance part of Sue's support secure base model there. If we are secure as a team, if we're learning through, our experiences, I don't want to say mistakes, but our experiences, then, actually we can be a very secure team for future students, but we need to kind of accept, where we were at and move on from that. Okay, next slide. That might be it. I'm not sure. There we go. That was me. So apologies, I think we are running slightly ahead of time, behind time, but yeah, I'll hand over back to Sue for any questions.
Thank you very much, Helen. And this slide just is a short reference slide with including the where the resource was, looking at the team as a secure base model, and also the previous team around the student webinar that I referred to earlier. And this slide is just the task and finish group I mentioned that looked at readiness for placement practice when we were talking about helpful templates that might just be pointers and reminders of what to think about in those early stages of placement. This is something that a practice educator would be more likely to be using, but as a team manager, it's also useful to be perhaps thinking about some of these things, or to be having this conversation with your practice educator on your team before a student arrives. So that's just a tick box reference that might be useful. And so that brings us to the point of any questions or points for discussion that anybody would like to raise on the webinar. We have got a few minutes. If there are any questions or comments, it's over to you if anyone's got anything that they wish to raise.